Title: The New West. Author: Interfectorem. Chapter 1: Beginnings. It's really hard to think about how you were when you were a kid because life changes all around you, as well as the people in it. You just develop into who you are and what you stand for without even really noticing it or experiencing any sort of grand event. I had nothing but good memories about my childhood and grew up believing in good and evil until I felt the fire. I felt it burn me away but didn't truly understand its effects until many years later. That fire made me eventually realize that there was no true good and evil. There was no black and white to morality. Though the two extremes did exist, there is a giant space of gray in the middle between them. Some say I am evil, and some say that I am good, but my past will hopefully show that I am simply nothing. I was in the black as well as the white, but ultimately I believe I ended up in the gray. All that depends entirely upon who you ask. I was what everybody in the wasteland might call a drifter. I was never in a single place for more than maybe a week or two. I drank in bars, saloons, and brothels, ran odd jobs for people, helped look tough for trade caravans across the deserts, and got myself into more than my fair share of trouble. Whether it was the use of chems, liquor, or cards, I somehow managed to get myself into a bad situation if I stayed in one place for too long. However, I believe that fact could be said for most people in the wastes. I roamed the wasteland for a long time, only calling this planet my home. I wasn't always that way, though, and I wasn't born into that kind of existence. I talked about my childhood and the fire for a reason. I was born in the year 2234 on a Brahmin ranch north of that dead and vacant city known by people of the Southern California wastes as the Necropolis. Our family homestead was north of those ruins and a bit northeast of the hub, which everyone knows was a sprawling city of commerce that came to prominence in the early years after the bombs of 2077. So, the ranch was our home. It was just Ma, Pa, my older brother Bill, and my baby sister Abilene. I was the middle child, so I had to do most of the ranch work with Pa while Bill always stood watch for raiders or other troublemakers. Sometimes Bill helped out around the ranch, but mostly it was just Pa and I while Ma raised little Abilene. It's hard to remember exactly who my brother was since it had been so long. But from what little I can remember, Bill was the best big brother anyone could really ask for. My difficulty remembering his characteristics was replaced by what he taught me and all the little lessons that helped me survive over the years. Bill taught me everything from scavenging the desert ruins, how to find food and water, what had value to different types of people, and even how to shoot. When he wasn't on watch, and when me and Pa's workday came to an end, he and I played games and roped Brahmin. I remember when I was a little guy, he used to read stories to me by the lantern light about travelers and heroes of the wasteland. He had a way with words and a certain emphasis in his storytelling that made wasteland legends come to life as I drifted off to sleep. Ma and Pa were the greatest. At the time, I never really thought about how lucky I was to have parents and a loving family, even though I knew the world outside was so dangerous. Ma was always there, teaching me and my siblings how to read and write, or giving little lessons about historical events. I don't know where Ma got all the knowledge she had, but she always talked about living near the LA boneyard long before I was born. How Ma got to settle down with a barely literate rancher north of the hub, I'll never know. So, she was always looking out for us and sharing her loving embrace when one of us kids got hurt by a wasteland critter, or just by dealing with the ranch life. Ma was a very lively and well-educated woman, but Pa was the typical quiet and stern rancher man. He was just that kind of person. He loved all of us dearly and showed me just about every other thing I know. Whether it was running the ranch when he was out, or how to dust myself off after taking a beating, Pa was a great man. Ranch life went on simply as could be for most of my childhood, but on occasion, he would take us all to the hub to experience the big city. After hiring a mercenary or two to guard the ranch, Bill and I would load up our goods to sell in town and the whole family left going southbound. We weren't rich by any means, but offering wasteland guns for hire free access to our food stores and liquor cabinet was as good a payment as any. Then there was little Abilene, and she was the baby. When I was 13, she was 7, and Ma and Pa treated her like the little princess she was. However, I have to admit that I did too. Sometimes siblings tend to get envious of all the affection shown to the newest born in a family, but that wasn't the case with Abilene. Even after a long day of back-breaking work around the ranch, that little girl waddling over to give me a hug always turned the hardest days around. She made me and Bill little trinkets out of rocks, twigs, and other desert debris and gave them to us with the most heartwarming, gap-toothed, prideful smile I ever seen even to this day. I tried to make her sweet little gestures up to her, so whenever I went to town with Pa and Bill, I was sure to use what little cash I had to buy her a nice doll or something. Her eyes would light up like the stars at night after seeing the little toys I'd bring her. And the fact I made her smile would give me one of my own. Abilene and I shared a room, and I helped her go to sleep countless nights by retelling one of the stories I heard from Bill or Pa. That little girl woke me up every morning with a soft nudge and that gap-toothed grin looking right at me. She was my best friend in the world. I knew the world out there was unforgiving even at my age, so I guess I loved her so much for her innocence. Something this world was seriously lacking. I was so blind back then, I never saw all the problems with owning an independent ranch during the Republic's expansion north. The new California Republic, or NCR, was born out of a tiny settlement far to the north called Shady Sands in the late 2100s. They had been swallowing up communities left and right, promising stable government, protection, food, and safe roads long before I was even born. So, by the time I was born, we were considered citizens of the NCR, since the hub was only a dozen or so miles to the southwest. The NCR incorporated the hub long ago and consisted of several Southern California territories known as states. The NCR's reach went from Shady Sands, far to the north, and all the way to Dayglow, many miles south of us and past the LA Boneyard. I had no idea how far their northern expansion had gotten. By 2248, however, their military was annexing many territories north of their capital and poured resources into backing a movement of wastelanders going east. Growing up, I thought the NCR were the good guys finally bringing civilization to all of California since the bombs fell all those years ago. But none of that was relevant to a young kid pressed by the burden of helping his family run a ranch. Chapter 2: How Life Is. In the year 2248, I was 14, and NCR events were just starting to affect us. Ever since I was born, my family were citizens of the NCR, but that title didn't really play any part in our lives. All our citizenship meant was that we had to pay a small portion of our profits to the tax collectors when we went into town. However, in 2248, President Tandy of the NCR died, and their national efforts were still focused on the far north. Since 2242, the NCR military was engaged in a war up north against slavers, tribals, raiders, and some group called the Enclave. We were largely unaffected by any wars since we were in the heart of NCR territory. But after they achieved some big victory at a place on the coast, their war efforts turned to annexing northern townships. So NCR explorers headed east, and their military waged a campaign of pacifying the north. With the death of the president, tremendous military efforts, and an expansion of borders, came an increased demand for food and resources, something our small amount of land had plenty of. Our family owned that ranch and the land around it since my great-grandfather on my pa's side got help from some ghoul mercenaries before the hub's Great Merchant War. I was too ignorant to understand what it meant when NCR representatives showed up and began hounding my pa for land rights. Basically, the NCR representatives wanted Pa to simply hand over our family home to their employer, the Weston Ranching Company of NCR. Months went by, and Pa would be up all night going over finances and trying to work out a deal with the Weston Company while Ma stood over his shoulder. I would listen through the doors and constantly heard the Weston guys get chased out saying, "We'll keep coming back until you decide to sell." I was too young to really understand what was truly going on, but at the age of 14, the sight of Weston employees coming up the road became a regular event. The Weston employees stepped onto our lands from the south almost twice a week, sometimes bringing a trader from the hub with them. I'd show the Weston guys inside and talk to the traders with Bill. I usually spent what little I had on odds and ends, sometimes a pack of gum or something for Abilene. Bill, on the other hand, would do Father's job I was supposed to do and buy supplies for the ranch. I saw the Weston guys leave with Pa shouting at them from the porch saying, "Never come back," countless times. Every time he yelled for them to never come back, they'd shrug it off only to return a few days later for months on end. One time, however, it worked. I was still 14 at the time, and about 2 months went by without seeing the Weston employees. After a few weeks of anticipation, we all concluded that they must have given up. On the day my life changed, the fire just settled after I burned the outhouse pit, and the sky was getting dark. I took in the sunset and glanced towards the south to see half a dozen glowing objects in the distance coming up the trail to our homestead. A few minutes went by and the quiet sunset was interrupted by a couple of gunshots from Bill's little guard post. Looking towards the house, I saw Ma and Pa run out to the porch with rifles in their hands. I panicked as they both opened fire on the people coming up to the house. Soon, bullets rocked the ranch, and I was still by the outhouse, scared for my life. I did the first thing that came to mind. I slid down into the hole at the bottom of the outhouse and moved the cover back over it. I sat there curled up in a burnout pit of ash and shit, just listening to my family get slaughtered outside. I waited in there and did the only thing I could, listen, as the terrible fumes from that hole flooded my nostrils. About 10 minutes went by and the gunfire stopped. 10 more minutes passed before I lifted the cover off the pit and emerged from the outhouse to see our home glowing and wrapped in a giant fire under the night sky. There I saw her laying face up by the porch. It was Abilene. I tried to wrap my mind around what happened and ran over to my baby sister, whose cries were the only other sound besides the crackle of fire. Throwing all other feelings and thoughts aside, I darted over to Abilene and held her in my arms as she cried uncontrollably. A bullet hole marked her left abdomen, staining her little pink dress with more and more blood each second that passed. I rocked her in my arms, singing to her softly and telling her over and over again, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." The tears poured from my eyes and it was getting harder and harder to sing to her. I watched her face lose color, her eyes go white, and heard her terrified sobs get weaker and weaker. I held her as tight as I could and kissed her fading cheek over and over again. She whispered one last thing as the life in her body was almost gone. "I don't want to die." Just like that, she was dead. The world had taken the only innocent thing in it and killed it. I cried, screamed, and pounded my fists into the rocky sand until they were bloody and numb. I ran around the house looking for something, or anything, as my mind raced. I couldn't find Ma or Pa until I saw a charred hand hanging out of the doorway to our house, burned into oblivion. In those moments, I saw nothing but fire and red. Not even thinking about what I was doing, I sprinted over to the guard post to find Bill dead next to his chair. It is all a blur now, but I pulled the .357 revolver from his still warm hands and dug up the little cache we had next to the guard post with a nearby shovel. I pulled the footlocker from the earth and blasted the lock off. Inside, grabbed the other .357 revolver, put on the belt, and grabbed all 3 boxes of ammo. Without even considering any sort of plan, I sprinted into the desert. I must have run 6 or so miles until I saw a distant glow in the middle of the desert. The fire from the house could still be seen in the opposite direction, so I looked back and approached the fire in front. I looked through my binoculars and saw that they were all sleeping. Not one of them was on watch. I crouched and got closer and closer, seeing all 6 of their illuminated bodies resting around the fire. I stood up from behind a rock, revolver in hand, and went guns blazing. I put 2 rounds into one of them, missed one, hit another in the chest, hit another one twice, and felt the click of an empty gun. Before I could pull out the other loaded revolver, I was hit in the chest, and everything went black. Chapter 3. Alone in the World. I woke up staring at a wood ceiling with a lone fan spinning overhead. A man entered my vision and looked down at me. I stared straight up at that ceiling and disregarded the man for the sharp pain in my chest, but I felt physically fine otherwise. The guy only said that he was a trader and that he found me in the desert. He said how he brought me to the hub, where a doc pulled a .44 out of me that somehow ended up next to my left armpit. The man said that he didn't peg me for a murderer, and that any kid who decided to assault 6 NCR mercs probably had good reason. He informed me that he paid the doctor in advance, and that as soon as I was feeling up to it, I could go. Pointing to my clothes and weapons on the table, he said, "Good luck, kid." Just like that, the trader left, and I never even got his name or the chance to say thank you. I sat there on my bed and cried. I cried for my family, my life, and what I was going to do for the rest of my life. My entire life was ruined in a single evening. I had no idea what I was going to do at that point and didn't have the mental energy for any sort of planning. When the doc came in, I wiped away my tears, sold him one of my handguns, and sold most of the remaining ammo in exchange for all the morphine and Med-X he could spare. With that, I got dressed and left into the wastes, going nowhere. I walked the roads for a long time after that, not going anywhere in particular. At first, I tried to find purpose in places like the Boneyard in San Fran. I hitchhiked with caravans for safety in numbers, but each place didn't seem like the right fit, and I eventually found myself in trouble for one reason or another. Soon, nothing ever felt right. It felt like California was dead. Even with civilization springing up everywhere, I just found myself wandering east and doing simple jobs for people in podunk little towns out in the middle of nowhere. I soon earned a reputation around the NCR southern frontier as a drifter. Drifter was a title much like prospector or scavenger. It seemed like everywhere I went, people looked at me like I was a piece of shit. When I first started wandering, I was still young, so people looked at me like a lost child. As I grew up and entered new towns, the badge of a drifter became bigger and bigger, creating my entire identity. Nobody likes drifters simply because lonely people who come out of the wasteland could be anyone. People were cautious when they looked at me, not knowing if I was a murderer, raider, mercenary, refugee, squatter, junkie, or mutant. Usually people thought I was just a chem addict looking for a new place to sleep, so I usually took up with the squatters. I had been robbed 23 times, stabbed 12 times, and shot 3 times in those years drifting from town to town in Southern California. Everywhere I went, townsfolk merely tolerated me, and criminals saw a fresh victim. Most of the time, I literally didn't have anything to offer my muggers, so they would typically beat the shit out of me and steal the clothes off my back. Then I would have to beg on the streets, or steal essentials from clothes to food just to get by. When I got caught stealing, I'd get chased out of town and have to go somewhere else. After being chased out of too many towns, I gradually utilized Bill's lessons on how to live off the land and what plants were edible. I applied what I learned so long ago and taught myself how to find water in even the driest of places. Eventually, I only really entered frontier towns to steal chems from the squatters or supplies from the least guarded stores. On one occasion, I stole a merc's handgun while he was passed out in a brothel but got caught in the act, and the whole town tried to lynch me. I don't even remember how I escaped that, but I had to run into the desert only to wander ever southward and into the fringe of the NCR frontier. I very quickly became the kind of drifter every frontier town assumed I was, a no-good thief. I sold the chems I stole, effectively becoming a roving chem pusher, and sold the goods I'd pickpocket for ammunition or different commodities I needed. After years of wandering and being thrown out of countless towns, I reached the wild wasteland that nobody ever went to. Before I decided to enter the unknown wasteland, I headed north one last time. I entered the hub, to a similar scene of people looking at me like I don't belong, and walked to the main road north. I stayed in the familiar town for a few days, but certain places triggered emotional responses from memories I had with my family. Most of the southern frontier NCR towns were so isolated from the main territories that I spent years without any kind of news about the nation I was still a citizen of. In the hub, I learned that the northern expansion was still going on, but there was a new war with the Brotherhood of Steel. I heard about that group of technology seekers from the stories Bill used to tell me. They seemed like the ideal heroes and wasteland badasses liquefying mutants and striding around in that fancy pre-war armor. By this point, I was pretty disillusioned with the country I belonged to, so it only seemed right that they'd declare war on a noble military organization that tried to save technology from bad people. However, my disillusionment would only be solidified when I went back home. I left the hub and entered the wasteland, walking northeast back to my old home. Seeing the hollow skyscrapers of the necropolis far to the east, I got more nervous the closer I got to my old home. I eventually stepped onto a freshly made dirt road going to the site of the home I grew up in. When I got close enough, I reached a new wooden fence unlike the old chipping one I remembered. I looked at the sign on the new fence post and it read, Hub Homestead, and below it, Property of Weston Ranching Company. It all came back and hit me like a brick. After years of roaming and being screwed over left and right, I remembered what happened to my family and cried thinking about how things could have been. I sobbed and gripped my handgun tightly while seriously considering the idea of burning their house down. I saw the newly constructed ranch house in the distance and a large herd of Brahmin grazing beyond it. I felt the tears come to the surface again as the memories washed over me. I had little political knowledge, but I knew the Weston Ranching Company was highly influential in the NCR's government. Upon opening the wounds I spent years trying to forget, I felt utterly betrayed by the entire world. I simply couldn't believe that they could slaughter my family and just move in like nothing happened at all. There, I turned my back on my old home for the last time and walked south, seeing my family every time I shut my eyes. At night, I'd lay there in the pitch-black wastes on my sleeping bag just waiting for some wasteland creature to come along and eat me. I closed my eyes to sleep and saw my baby sister's last moments. I saw it all night, the blood slowly soaking her little dress, her face turning pale white, and those words, "I don't want to die," again and again and again, until morning came. I walked to the south, passing every tiny town that ever threw me out until I reached the edge of NCR known land. I almost made it to the border of a place that used to be called Mexico, but was driven east by packs of feral coyotes or monstrous lizards. For weeks, I walked slowly into nothing, only instinctively running when a monster tried to eat me. Eventually, I reached a large river called the Colorado on my old map. I sat on the banks of the river for a few days reflecting on the past years and concluded that there was nothing left for me in California. It was the year 2257, and I crossed over the Colorado River after 9 years of wandering with no purpose. I fought the current of that river and stepped into the Arizona wasteland or Sonoran wasteland depending on who you ask. Chapter 4: The Sonoran Wastes. I stepped foot on the eastern side of the Colorado near the ruins of Yuma in mid-2257. I managed to cross the river on a makeshift boat at the narrowest point I could find. Almost immediately upon stepping onto Arizona sands, I was confronted by a group of local tribals. They let me pass, and I actually traded a few of my belongings for some supplies. I ended up spending most of my time around Yuma, and eventually found myself living alone in the desert near a wildlife refuge from before the bombs. The wildlife refuge was several miles north of Yuma and very secluded from anyone. Nobody traveled out to my little shack in the desert, so I was safe from the raiders and preppers, for the most part, who I quickly learned were a plague to everyone in the Sonoran Wastes. From what little I'd seen of southern Arizona, I felt more at home on this side of the Colorado than I had anywhere else since that life-altering night so long ago. Claiming the wildlife refuge as my own, I made myself a nice shack with brick and scrap from a couple of little ruined structures and found solace in the open desert. Life for me was so peaceful and tranquil at this time, and my seclusion from the rest of the world made me love the act of leaving California behind. With no real worries, I took on the role of a desert hermit and loved making my own spot away from everyone. I only really had to deal with a rad scorpion or teal iguana if they strayed too close, and spent my first days and months in Arizona making my shack mine and gathering seeds for a nice little cacti farm. As much as I loved living alone, I did go and trade with the tribe in Yuma on occasion. I mostly traded iguana meat, skins, or scorpion parts in exchange for ammunition, tools, and miscellaneous essentials. Especially because there was plenty of critters and cactus fruit on my land to keep me safe and sustained at that isolated little plot. Although I lived alone in that desert shack, was safe, and loved the environment of Arizona, I was brand new to the Sonoran wasteland. After getting my shack situated and exploring a little further beyond the Yuma tribal lands and wildlife refuge, it became clear that Arizona was a hostile territory. There was no NCR or any sort of unified government in these lands. Even though I was largely secluded and spared from most human activity, little explorations into the desert revealed the true nature of the Sonoran Wastes. Some reading this may have heard stories about what Arizona was like in this time, but the descriptions don't do it justice. Only a few miles outside of my secluded safe haven was a never-ending war zone across the desert. It wasn't like a great big battle between two grand armies. Instead, the Arizona deserts were a giant quagmire of warring tribals, raiders, preppers, mutants, creatures, settlers, and countless other factions or gangs hostile to everyone who wasn't one of them. I still don't know why my domicile was somehow spared from the chaotic desert, but I didn't care and was happy enough to simply live alone in my shack for a long time. People hadn't been good to me for most of my life, and even though the territory I grew up in was much safer in comparison, I preferred the chaotic Sonoran Wastes. Life as a recluse in the desert lost its touch after about a year, so I ended up wandering again. I primarily headed down south, just because the Yuma tribals were regular customers for my skins and goods. Arizona was a large place, and visits to the tribals and tiny communities outside my safe spots told me many things. At one point, I heard about a notable place called Phoenix. I never traveled to Phoenix during this time, but the stories about it intrigued me. On occasion, I'd hear a tribal or the rarely friendly settler talk of a sprawling city in the heart of the Arizona wastes. Though the prospect of a sprawling metropolis piqued my curiosity, I never truly wanted to go there. Even with all the time that passed after my family was killed, I didn't really like being around too many other people, and the few friendly southern Arizona people or tribals I knew were sufficient enough. My instinct to stay away from cities in particular was especially because I nearly got killed for a misunderstanding in the city of San Fran a few years back. So I occasionally drifted into one of the few friendly towns in southern Arizona, doing little jobs or working with traders as an extra hand. I no longer had to push drugs or steal from people to get by. My secluded shack in the desert gave me ample meat to sell, or skins to trade, and I finally felt like something of an upstanding citizen in this lawless wasteland. Even though I was mostly just a desert hermit and ex-drifter, the need for human interaction still got to me every once in a while. Most of those little trips to friendly places were boring or made me want to go back to my shack, but one odd job I found myself on ended up giving me a reputation in the South that I never imagined when crossing the Colorado. On this particular journey, I entered a 20-person township several miles east of Yuma that I occasionally sold to, and signed on with a departing trade outfit. It was about time I went a little further east than I was familiar with. The trip was lengthy, lasting a few solid days, but on that caravan trek, and a few miles west of our destination, the city of Tucson, I got into a bit of a scuffle with some raider from Mexico who thought a little too highly of himself. The caravan halted dead in its tracks as his gang lorded over us from the sand dunes. The raider walked up with only a little switchblade in hand and confronted the caravan boss, which was very unusual for raiders. Usually they ain't ones for conversation. The guy stopped in front of us, and before he spoke, I noticed the caravan crew visibly shaking, and all of the guards held their guns above their heads. I was still standing next to the head of the caravan, an aging Hispanic woman who went by, Miss Cruz, who was shaking just as much. I then took in the raider, a short Mexican man in metal leg armor with leather bandoliers strewn across his body with lots of bullets lining the straps. His face was clean and baby-faced while the two raiders behind him stood a ways off as he stopped less than 4 feet from me and Miss Cruz. The raider spoke. "Oi, I see you and your crew did the right thing upon seeing me, chica. All the boys know to stand down when they see me coming." He was looking at all the surrendering guards while speaking to Miss Cruz and continued. "Me and my gang are taking a prepper palace next month. Good we don't gotta waste ammo on you all." The raider was about to gesture for his guys to come over and take our stuff when he stopped himself. What made him stop was when his eyes finally landed on me, and he noticed that I was the only person in the caravan not shaking or surrendering my weapon. In fact, in that moment, I noticed my hands were still tightly held around my revolver, aimed at the ground right in front of him. The raider saw this and let loose a laugh. "Ooh! Ha! We got us a hero, amigos." His guards were standing too far away to hear him and join in the laugh over the winds. He closed the distance while I saw Miss Cruz shaking even more out of the corner of my eye. The short, baby-faced Mexican raider stood less than a foot from me, with his face right in mine, but slightly lower due to his height. The raider's volume didn't lower. He shouted in my face, "You think you're some fucking tough guy? You think you can take me on? Is that it, puto?" I honestly can't say I knew what I was thinking, especially with what he did next. He put his hand on my lowered handgun, raised it up, and pointed it at his forehead while saying, "Here, I'll help you, amigo." Ha ha ha. Give you a chance. I was pressing the cold barrel of my handgun to the insane raider's head solely because he made me. Not understanding what was happening, the raider continued shouting at me with my gun pressed to his head. "You gonna pull the trigger? What's it going to be, cabron? You wouldn't even think of pulling that trigger if you knew who I was. Do you know who I am, pinche waster? You know why you surrender when I show up? You know whose head you're aiming that gun at? Go ahead, pull the trigger, ha ha ha, pinche cabron." I had done as the raider told me to. I pulled the trigger and watched his eyes grow wide as the other side of his head burst at the gunshot. The raider collapsed in front of me as he fell to his knees and then slumped over onto the desert. Silence. For a solid 5 seconds, all that could be heard was the wind before the uproar and gunfire. As I looked at the raider's body on the sand in front of me, I noticed the gunfire wasn't from the gang atop the dunes or the distant crew. They were from the guns behind me. The other guards of the caravan crew were shooting at the raider gang. Coming back to the moment, I saw the raiders' gang blindly firing at us as they ran away in fear. As the rest of the raider gang fled into the wastes in sheer panic, our guns stopped and everyone collected their breaths. As the guards and caravan crew patted themselves for injuries, they all looked at me in astonishment. It was then that I caught the eye of Miss Cruz. The caravan boss breathed deeply in and out, still excited from the situation when she said to me with a look of bewilderment on her face, "Ay Dios mío, "Do you know who you just killed?" I responded, confused by her expression and the rest of the crew's expressions. No? Just some punk trying to take our stuff, right?" The others began gathering around me as she said, No, mijo, that was El Tiro de Muerte." I asked confused, "The death shot? Really? That's his name?" I looked down at the raider who laid there in the sands with a face forever blazoned in shock. "And a new hole." Miss Cruz said, See, he is the most infamous raider this side of the border. You killed him and his men are fleeing." Turning to the rest of the party, she shouted, "3 cheers for our drifter." I was just about as confused as could be. I literally did what El Tiro de Muerte told me to do, shoot him in the head. The entire trading outfit celebrated me the rest of the way to Tucson and bought me drinks in one of the cantinas upon arrival. They threw their most valuable possessions at me, saying I was their savior. I was simply astounded by the reception I was getting. As confused as I was about the reception I got for the simple deed, I thought about how dumb that raider was, and how I didn't deserve the reaction everyone had. However, based on the reaction of the caravan crew and people of Tucson, I just figured the raider's reputation got to his head a bit and gave him some sort of immortality complex. Either way, I just blasted some little Mexican punk in the face simply because he told me to, and now I was a hero amongst the people of southern Arizona. Not knowing how to take all the praise, the more free drinks I got made me just accept it and reveled a bit. I ended up spinning the story to make it sound better after Miss Cruz left, but I was loving life for the first time and as long as I could remember. Years of people treating me like complete shit was all changed by that brief moment on the caravan trail to Tucson. Now was the time to feel better and cash in on my originally bullshit hand, so I decided to indulge a little. Being a folk hero in those parts helped me get free drinks and all, plus an occasional donation of caps. One thing I noticed about the Sonoran wasteland was that the people used bottle caps as currency. Like in stories I heard about the initial years after the bombs first fell. Although living well and indulging in the foreign feeling of admiration was nice, it wasn't long before I felt the need to leave. After a couple of months of sleeping in motels and the streets of what's left of Tucson, I left. I headed back to my shack for a while, just living off the land in solitude. Even though I was comfortable living alone, I visited the town several times over the years. Every time I entered Tucson, people instantly recognized me and essentially threw their belongings at me. Some Mexican men even approached me dragging their daughters behind and pleaded with me to give them children. The whole hero thing got to my head whenever I was in Tucson, and I deemed many daughters unworthy of my heroic seed. But I gladly accepted the free drinks and rooms. Every person who thanked me reminded me about how silly the whole situation was. I just shot an idiot raider in the face and the people viewed me as their savior. Many told me that I made the town so much safer and that the gang remnants fled at the mere mention of me. I would get drunk in the cantinas and in my drunken state, explain that the event was way less dramatic than people thought. That didn't change any minds though. The crowds of people waiting to buy me drinks said I was just being humble. Apparently, the story that circulated considered my explanation but concluded, I was just so fast a pistolero that the infamous raider didn't have a chance to pull his gun. This was despite the fact that he approached us with just a switchblade and literally held my gun to his head. When I went into town, I'd spend a few weeks there, always arriving to a hero's welcome. Then I'd trade with people using my hero's discount on the few occasions people didn't give me stuff for free. Life was fun being a Tucson hero, but I always headed back to my life of seclusion in the desert wildlife refuge. I lived in that shack for years whenever I wasn't in town and never saw many people. Those few that found their way over to my isolated safe haven were usually very friendly. If the visitors came from Tucson, they would give me free stuff. If they were from the wastes, they were generally pretty nice or indifferent and did some trading. There was an occasional group of raiders that found me after establishing my reputation. However, upon seeing who I was, they always disappeared into the desert in utter terror. I did get a group of preppers every now and then who weren't really terrified by my reputation but left me alone when seeing my lack of military hardware. Preppers were an interesting bunch, but I'll explain who they were later. So, I spent my days at the shack usually all alone. I mostly hunted the little critters, harvested desert fruits, got water at tiny oases, or read from my collection of pre-war magazines and books. Despite my new life in the Sonoran wastes and happiness from the new reputation, I was still plagued by my own past in California. Visions of my family getting killed kept my mind awake on particularly lonely nights. Life in the Sonoran wastes was pretty good for me, But everything I heard about the Arizona wasteland in Tucson or passing caravans was different. As I mentioned before, only a few miles from my shack were the open wastes and a never-ending war between any and all who called the desert their home. Though I was still spared from the wasteland horrors, my reputation and location eased my mind. For me, life in Arizona was good. Not too many in the open desert could say the same. Chapter 5, 2261. In January 2261, loneliness got the better of me and I headed north to a large ranch that I heard was friendly enough called Agua Caliente. I knew that the people there were preppers, so I approached the place with a cautious mindset. At that point, I hadn't been to Tucson in a while and had only seen 4 people over the course of 6 months. Crazy inbreds or not, I needed some human interaction. I waltzed onto the Jackson Brothers Ranch, where they welcomed me with open arms. There, they gave me discounts for the weariest of travelers. I liked the Jackson Brothers and all their family. They were a lot less militant than other preppers I'd come across. Preppers were notorious for being highly xenophobic and heavily armed. They were one of many dangerous factions in the Sonoran wastes, and believed to be the descendants of people who were ready for the bombs that scorched the earth in 2077. Their ancestors stockpiled military equipment and weapons in isolated spots across the vast deserts, far from large pre-war cities like Tucson and Phoenix. Somehow surviving the nuclear winter after the bombs fell, the prepper communes grew from their backyard bunkers completely ready for the post-nuclear world. They kept to themselves mostly, but some of the larger prepper communities sent out large, heavily armed groups to scavenge the wasteland. The general rule in regard to preppers was, if you see them, run. Rumors encircled the many prepper communities about their incestuous tendencies and even cannibalism from some of the more isolated groups. I'd come across a few scenes over the years where wastelanders laid in the sands filled with lead or turned into piles of ash from prepper-made makeshift flamethrowers or their crude laser rifles. They were still no better than typical raiders. Aside from their unique identifiers, they still killed whoever had stuff they wanted, and hated almost anyone that wasn't part of their commune. However, Agua Caliente wasn't home to the typical weapon-toting doomsday prepping maniacs. Instead, the Jackson Brothers ran a nice place and did well, several miles off the main caravan road from Tucson to Phoenix. I ended up staying in their lovely southwestern-style little motel room for a couple of weeks, and helped them around the ranch where they needed. Things went well and good in that time, and I was just happy to be in the company of seemingly decent people. My life took a sudden turn when I came in from the range one evening and started relaxing in their dining room. There I caught the eye of Haley Jackson, who brought me a nice cold drink on the house. I got her to sit down and we ended up talking for most of the night. She was quite the looker with her long blonde hair, slight underbite, wide blue eyes, and fairly clean face. At the end of the evening, I took her up to my room to get to know her better, which was one of the worst mistakes of my life. I guess one of her family members saw her leaving my room the next morning half naked, which was a no-go. During that night of lust, I forgot that preppers tended to be a bunch of crazy inbreds. After the past few weeks of nice company, I assumed the preppers of Agua Caliente were different, but I was mistaken. So word spread quickly, and the Jackson brothers didn't take too kindly to the fact that I got to have sex with their sister before they did. The next thing I knew, the two were pounding on my door. I opened it hoping for a civilized discussion, but they knocked me out with one solid hit. I woke up being submerged in water, with 2 strong arms holding me under. When they pulled me out, it was none other than the Jackson brothers screaming about how I fucked their sister. I gasped for air and found myself wearing nothing but my underwear and boots from the day. How they managed to take off my pants without my boots, I don't really know, but I briefly felt a knife wound going down my leg. Through frantic breaths, I tried telling them to let me go, but they submerged me again. Face held in a dirty washing tub, I struggled for air. Tracing the knife wound with a free hand, I remembered I kept a spare utility knife in my boot. The incestuous duo pulled me out again, but this time I fought back. Gilbert Jackson forced me to the ground and threw his fists into my face twice before I ripped the knife out of my boot and drove it into his gut repeatedly. Gilbert screamed in agony, and his brother Chuck reached for a gun. I somehow managed to pull the revolver out of Gilbert's holster and shot Chuck twice in the chest. Forcing Gilbert off of me, I stabbed him in the chest 20 more times. I collected myself and quickly sought a way to get dressed in what was available. I just noticed that the main door was locked and frantically scrambled to get dressed while looking for a way out. The white shirt Gilbert previously wore was now completely coated red with his blood, but its loose fitting made me take it anyway. Before I could take his pants off, I heard a commotion outside. Panicking, I ripped the only other article of clothing I saw off the clothesline, a knee-length black skirt. Mind going every direction, I frustratedly threw on the women's apparel simply because it was easier than the overly tight pants the late Jackson brothers wore. I gathered up the brothers' ammo belts and weapons as fast as I could, but just then, the barn door creaked open. I saw the barrel of an assault rifle poke through the door, and it began blindly firing in my direction. I jumped behind a collapsed wagon, watching the high-caliber rounds rip the barn interior apart. Returning a couple of shots at the barn door, I saw a small doorway and ran out the back into the desert. I ran as fast as I could for a while. Glancing back, I saw a dozen preppers still chasing me from the way I came. I ran like I never did before, for almost 2 hours straight until the figures seemed to just give up. Even though they stopped chasing me, I kept going until the sun was high above. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone from Agua Caliente, but being exhausted and dehydrated, I collapsed into the sand. Chapter 6: City of Sun. I had been unconscious more times in my life than anyone I have ever met. Whether it was my days using chems or getting knocked out by muggers, I was in a familiar situation. It had been a few years at that point since I was thrown out of a town for causing trouble. Life in the shack and my reputation in Tucson lowered my guard a substantial degree. Needless to say, I wasn't exactly expecting the events at Agua Caliente to turn out the way they did. Not entirely sure how long I was out, I woke up in the middle of the desert to an armored woman pouring vodka on my face. The sudden departure from dreamland startled me and I shouted, "What? Where am I?" The woman stood over me, blocking the sun, and said, "We picked you up a couple of miles back. Name's Bailey, by the way." She paused briefly as I stirred awake and added, "Was gonna pour water on you, but we're a little short as is." I looked around to take in where I was and see if my surroundings were safe. We were at a little campsite off the road. I was with a caravan or trading party, and all the other caravan hands were relaxing or doing their own thing. In the distance and just past the woman in front of me was a sign that read, "Phoenix 10 miles. I looked up at the woman and asked, "Are we going to Phoenix?" The potent smell of the alcohol was gagging, but definitely enough to hasten my awakening. She knew I was fairly dehydrated and handed me a half-full canteen saying, "Yep, we're just hauling a bunch of junk for the traders in Tucson up here." She studied me for a moment while I chugged the water and said, "I didn't know you Legion boys went this far south. What you doing out here?" I looked at her puzzled as I handed the water back. "I ain't no Legion boy? What are you talking about?" She sat down next to me against a rock and said, "Oh, come on, we don't care. Your secret's safe with us. Who else runs around the desert in red tunics and tattered skirts?" I remembered the bizarre clothing I hastily threw on and studied my dirt and blood-covered attire, saying, "Someone very unlucky, and I prefer the term kilt." She looked skeptical, and I added, "Who are these Legion boys you talking about?" She paused for a minute at my sincerity. "You really ain't one of them?" I simply said, "No, what's their deal?" She watched me through her shades for a moment and said, "Well, all right, I guess I trust you. Those fellas belong to a massive tribe up north called Caesar's Legion. They're known across most of Arizona for looking pretty distinctive. Word is they go gallivanting around the desert killing tribals and looking like you more or less. Never thought they'd be this far south, all I'm saying. Hell, I'd even heard them called Roman wannabes, whatever a Roman is." Haha. I was just confused by what she was talking about and responded with, "Well, I'm not one of those guys. Didn't even know they existed." She handed me the water again and said simply, "Yeah, you're a bit too nice to be one of those Mars-worshipping war pups. Anyways, since you ain't got nothing on you except a couple revolvers and a fucking skirt, I tell you what, I'll buy you a pair of jeans when we get to Phoenix." She gave a laugh, and then the caravan workers started to pack up. I was just happy that it was these folks who found me instead of the preppers, and shook her hand saying, "Sounds like a good deal. Thanks, Bailey." The two of us got up and readied ourselves to head out. I took the time on the road to walk and talk with most of the other workers. In exchange for walking with them, I had to help keep watch as we moved. It was starting to get dark when we rounded a cliffside and Phoenix came into view. I wasn't really sure why I put off going to Phoenix for so long. It looked a lot like San Fran or the Boneyard, all destroyed. Though the city itself was an irradiated mess, The northern perimeter was all speckled with lights where the post-war city stood. In the middle of the valley were 3 giant craters all within a few miles of each other. The city itself was still a radioactive nightmare, but I heard stories down south about how the town of Phoenix was a sprawling hub of commerce and refuge for those down on their luck. Marching the road, we headed north around the western crescent wall to the north gate. Passing the ruined suburbs, the Phoenix Wall and main gate came into sight. The outskirts alone were amazing, all lit up with more caravan traffic joining us in the final stretch. Outside the wall, the surrounding community bustled with life as people traded, socialized, and stumbled out of the local bars. The caravan master halted our party just outside the gate at a trade post rest stop. The caravan crew began unloading their wares and finding a place to crash as the sky got even darker. Bailey turned and said to me, "We'll hold up here tonight and start selling our goods in the morning." I thanked her for everything, and she said, "Don't worry, I'll buy your new clothes in the morning. Have a good night." I noticed the bloody shirt I was wearing had a sack full of caps in the breast pocket, so I paid a nearby caravan worker for a sleeping bag, rolled the thing out, and laid down next to some other workers. Grabbing a nearby unconscious drunk's hat, I covered my face and went to sleep. I woke up hours later with the sun poking through the bottom of my cap. When I got up, I looked around to see the place busier than ever. I took the moment to survey my surroundings and see if Bailey was sleeping anywhere nearby, but I couldn't find her. I walked around the bazaar looking for her or the workers I was with, and everyone in the crowds gave me worried looks like I was there to cause trouble. It had been a while since I got those types of looks, but I knew I wasn't there for any malicious intent. So, I approached a nearby gate guard to ask about entering the city. The slim man was wearing an army helmet and metal plates across his chest and arms with a determined look of caution on his face. He adjusted his grip on the rifle as I approached, and his face got angrier. Thinking Bailey and the others had entered Phoenix, I decided to ask for entrance, and if he happened to notice the woman I came in with. What happened was completely different, and I didn't have the perception to understand why all the guards on the walls were training their rifles at me. The uneasy gate guard was standing only a few feet from me when I said, "Good morning, sir. I'd like to enter Phoenix, please." He scoffed. "I bet you would, Legion scum." I cocked an eyebrow and said, What was that for? Is it because of my outfit?" "I tell you, I just found myself in a strange situation the other day. See, I'm just looking for my friends. We came in last night and," pressing the button on his radio, he said, "I'm gonna need some assistance at the gate." Darting his eyes at me, he spoke directly. "You think I don't know a Legion spy when I see one?" I was frustrated at this point, saying, "Look, do you really think that I would be dressed as one of them if I was trying to infiltrate Phoenix? Who the hell even are these Legion guys?" He shouted, "You tell me, Legion dog. That's just what a spy would say." Getting angrier, I shot back, "Look here, I'm not one of them. Do you want a bribe or something?" Reaching into the pocket of my skirt, I threw a handful of caps at him. "Happy now?" He gave me a look of sheer stupidity and bewilderment. "Trying to compromise the safety of Phoenix with a bribe, huh? That's not going to work, Legion man." I shouted, "Oh my God, just let me in." Suddenly, 2 men grabbed my arms, the gate guard threw a bag on my head and whacked me with a blunt object. I don't remember what happened after that, but I was unconscious yet again. I stirred awake to find myself on a horse-drawn cart in a forested wilderness and a man saying,
"Hey, you're finally awake. You were trying to cross the border, right?"
But then I awoke for real and was in a damp jail cell in prisoner's rags. Chapter 7. An Offer. I laid there on a bed staring up at the ceiling and listening to a lone drip of water every 4 seconds exactly. I remember staring up at the dark ceiling and thinking, this is so stupid. Why did I even leave my shack? Why didn't I just go to Tucson again? They actually like me there. How the hell long am I going to be here? Just then, I heard breathing from the other side of the bars. I disregarded it, but the silence broke when a man's deep voice said, "We know who you are." Looking up, I saw a man on the other side of the bars wearing a dark leather vest with different chems hanging off it. The man had long jet black hair and tan skin, looking sort of like one of them, Indians from the Old West holotapes or a tribal from the far north. I took in the deep and baritone voice for a second, but replied, "Yeah, I'm a Legion spy, right? I'm so deep undercover that even I didn't know I was a spy." He said, "I'm sorry for that. The people of Phoenix are very paranoid given all that is happening. We intended to approach you when you entered the city. However, by the looks of things, you entered the city, just not the way you intended." I asked, "So how do you know me then?" Placing his hands on the bars, he answered, "We received word of you from a caravan worker you already met." I realized who he was likely talking about immediately and asked, "So, who's this?" "We. And why did Bailey tell you about me?" The large man said, "I'll answer who we are soon." He muttered, "Wish Bailey would stop using her real name out there." Then he spoke directly to me again. "But Bailey recognized your face from sources down in Tucson. After she realized you weren't the typical Legion scout, she put 2 and 2 together. You have made quite a name for yourself down south, and we thought you might want to be involved in what we do." I let out a slight laugh and responded, "Really? You know why I'm famous down there, right?" The man nodded, but I explained anyway. "A few years ago, I shot some dumb raider punk in the face who happened to be a feared big shot. Not really sure why everyone was so scared of the guy, but I'm really not that big a deal." He said, "Well, regardless of your stance on your southern reputation, we are interested in recruiting you into our team." He paused momentarily, and I gave another scoff at my strangely acquired title. Then he said, "Now, I can leave you here in this cell for a few days if you'd rather have that. It won't be long before the trial of Phoenix will have you hanged as a spy, or you can take a walk with me. Your choice." Looking at him through the bars, I thought, he's got me there. I certainly didn't want to get hanged for being something I wasn't. So I told the man, "Let's take a walk." Chapter 8, The Capital. The strange man walked off. Moments later, a guard unlocked the cell, unshackled me, and said, "Doc is waiting for you down the hall." I approached the guy being escorted by the guard, who said to the man, "You got it from here, Doc?" The man tossed the guard a little sack of caps, and we quietly walked out of the prison together. We emerged from the dungeon-like facility into the heart of Phoenix. The sky was overcast, and people were everywhere. I had no idea that Phoenix was that big. Civilization out west had large cities that put Tucson to shame, but Phoenix was at the least comparable. Tucson had a few hundred people in it, but I never expected anything of Phoenix's magnitude to exist in the war-torn Sonoran wasteland. Taking in the sights of Phoenix and following the strange man, I asked, "So, Doc, huh?" He answered my sarcasm by saying, "Since we haven't formally met, my name is Doc Martin. That's what the people around here call me, at least." I said, "Well, nice to meet you, Doc Martin. So where are we going exactly?" He simply said, "You'll find out soon enough." Then asked, "So, what do you think of Phoenix? What do you think of what you see?" Still looking around the busy streets full of people going about their own, I said, "It's definitely the largest settlement I've come across. Minus Frisco, maybe, or the Boneyard." He gave me a slightly confused look at that last part, but I continued by saying, "Looks like people are making do. Despite my reception at the gate, it doesn't appear all bad." He grinned, but still kept his face forward. "Phoenix is quite something. This city is a beacon of civilization in the middle of a hostile desert full of tribals, monsters, and total chaos. The city that we occupy lies along the north edge of the crater that destroyed the place 200 years ago. What you see here is just an echo of the old-world metropolis that used to blanket the valley pre-war. Here, we have clean drinking water from the Great Western Reservoir, plenty of food from the old ruins, and countless ranches on the outskirts. However, this place is under constant threat from the wasteland monsters and tribals up north. The army of Phoenix has protected us from super mutant attacks, raider sieges, and overzealous preppers. However, what Phoenix is facing now is far worse than many of its people even realize." I asked, "What's this big threat?" Again, "You'll see soon enough." I was getting slightly irritated by the doc's cryptic responses to my questions. It wasn't long before we entered a small butcher shop crowded with wastelanders buying and selling different meats. We stood by for a moment, and then Doc Martin made eye contact with a man in a tan vest who gave him a nod. We then proceeded to a storage closet in the back of the shop and away from the shop's customers. The room was small but had lockers lining all the walls. Then the doc started changing into a radiation suit and said, "Open a locker and put on a suit." I asked why, and he just told me not to question him. So I followed his instructions. The suit was very loose and heavy and had a slightly fogged visor, but at least it was sealed. He proceeded to the back of the storage room and opened the far door, saying, "Follow close." We marched into what I saw to be the opposite edge of Phoenix. I looked out over the flat and rubble-filled desert ruins of the pre-war Phoenix. There, I noticed high-tech-looking lamppost-type things lining this side of the wall and stretching as far as could be. I asked the doc, "What are those?" He responded through the bulky radiation suit with a deep, muffled voice, "Those are rad posts. They keep the radiation of the craters from infecting the city. They help out against the sandstorms. But we still gotta treat the town during one of the bigger haboobs. If it weren't for those posts, we'd have died out long ago. Now stay quiet and stick with me, unless you want to serve as dinner for a pack of feral ghouls or deathclaws. I followed him through the ruins of Phoenix. The entire place was a flat desert full of concrete ruins and rubble with hollow skeletons of buildings dotting the lands for miles in all directions. The old roads were all disintegrated by the sun or blast from 200 years ago, making the area quiet and desolate. We walked for about 45 minutes before we reached the rocky edge of the downtown crater. I saw this crater on the way into town with the caravan, but never thought of entering the thing. Sticking with the doc, we began to climb down into the giant crater, and he whispered to me, "See that large building with the dome? That's where we're going." The sun was starting to set, and the shadows of the valley soon fell upon us. After hiking for another half hour along the crater, the lone building got closer. I recognized the thing from old pre-war magazines. It was the old Arizona Capitol building. I found it hard to believe the Capitol was still standing after a nearly direct hit from the bomb. The bright copper dome from the old magazines didn't describe the thing's present circumstances. From the looks of things, the gold dome oxidized over the years, turning it a dark and spotted sickly green color. We got closer and I noticed those rad posts surrounding it. Clearly there was someone using the place and the doc was taking us right to them. We climbed up a makeshift trail out of the crater and approached the door when 3 guards approached us with miniguns and radiation suits. Doc said to them, John Jack would be proud, and the leading guard said, "Good to see you again, Doc." Head on in. At the steps of the old Capitol, we started to take off our suits. The doc said, "When we get inside, just don't say anything. Only speak if someone asks you a question, and we'll get you out of those prisoner rags soon enough. Got it?" I gave a simple nod, and we approached the entrance. Doc Martin pushed open the grand doors, and there we were, inside the old Arizona Capitol building. The place didn't look like in those old magazines. The furniture was all wrecked. Grand paintings lost their glory to burns. And though the place was largely cleared of rubble, there were many mercenary-looking thugs lounging around. We entered the large atrium, and overlooking the entrance was a large black and white portrait of a rough-looking cowboy untouched by the bombs. The doc turned to me and said in his dry, monotonous, deep tone, "Welcome to the Capitol, and welcome to Swilling's Resistance." Chapter 9. Jack Swilling's Resistance. Before I could say anything, a man in a dirty white suit with gray hair and large-rimmed glasses approached with an elegant-looking woman on his arm. The woman was clean, slightly pale, and very beautiful. She was wearing a long blue dress and had red hair done up all fancy-like. I got no other words. But upon looking at her face, it hit me. "Bailey?" The woman next to the suited man hardly looked anything like the dirty armored caravan guard who poured vodka on my face the previous day. Standing in front of the duo, the spectacled man said to me, "Good to see you. Heard a lot about you. Sorry for that trouble at the gate. I am Jack Swilling, and I know you already met Bailey here." I shook his hand. Bailey gave me a wink and a slight smile while remaining silent. I said to her, "Good to see you again, Bailey." Bailey gave another smirk, but turning my attention back to Mr. Swilling, I said, "Nice to meet you too. Sue, why exactly am I here?" He smiled. "I'm glad you asked. Would be very strange if you didn't. Are you familiar with the legendary John W. Swilling?" Puzzled, I said, "No. He your dad or something?" The man led us over to the giant portrait of the cowboy and said, "John Jack Swilling was the founder of Phoenix. After staking his claim in Arizona sands, he vowed to defend Arizona till his last breath. He founded the Arizona Rangers and lead the way to Arizona's prosperity by owning mines, mills, and ranches. John Swilling even fought the nation he once called home for the Confederacy during the Great War of Northern Aggression. He served Arizona and Arizona alone to keep it safe from horrible tribals, raiders, outlaws, and even his own countrymen if necessary. I, Jack Swilling, am the direct descendant of that hero, and have vowed to take up my ancestors' legacy. The organization I founded seeks to follow in my namesake's footsteps and bring justice upon those who bring harm to the people of this desert." I nodded. "Sounds pretty noble." He grew a smile and asked, "You've been in Arizona for years now. Would you agree that Arizona is not the most secure land you've been to?" I replied somewhat honestly, "I used to be pretty safe at my shack. But yeah, Arizona is pretty bad. I began considering his previous question and wondered how he knew I wasn't originally from Arizona. Then he said, "I'm glad you agree. Our beloved Phoenix is safe in of itself, for now, but my organization's goal is to secure the people of Arizona's future by taking up arms against the hordes of degenerates and monsters that make the desert the nightmare it is." I asked frankly, but already somewhat knowing the answer, "So why are you called the Resistance? What are you supposedly resisting?" His face turned deeply serious as he said, "We are a resistance because we are the eyes and ears of the desert, and the only thing in the whole Sonoran wastes able to truly stand in the way of a growing danger up north. Caesar's Legion." I thought about this. Legion people kept mentioning and said, "Everyone keeps talking about this Legion? Who are they?" I was mistaken for one of them at the gate, but never even heard of them until Bailey found me. He looked up at the portrait of his ancestor and answered me. "The Legion is a disease that was spawned out of the Great Northern Canyon. They started as a man with an idea on how to escape a tough situation, but slowly grew into the monster we've yet to truly be affected by. The tribals across the Sonoran wasteland constantly fight each other for the pettiest of reasons and keep the desert inhospitable. That's part of what separates the people of the civilized valley from those degenerates up north. However, a clever man with too much knowledge of ancient civilizations harnessed the power of a meager tribe to destroy its enemies. Now calling himself Caesar, he has expanded his grip over most of northern Arizona and wages war in New Mexico. His shadow goes as far south as Sedona, but his armies grow and grow as he assimilates tribe after tribe. My organization has been battling the hostiles of the civilized valley for years, but in 2256, our mission changed." I interjected by asking, "In what way?" The man continued, "Caesar's Legion was a mere story from up north for many years. However, in 2256, the Legion threat became clear to all of Arizona when they destroyed the Ashwood Scholars tribe and secured the ruins of Flagstaff as their capital. Since then, Caesar's Legion has grown into a unified confederation of 35 of the largest and most hostile northern tribes. Though they wage war in New Mexico and are primarily confined to the north, my agents in the field have captured their scouts here in the valley. It is only a small matter of time before the Legion sets its sights on Phoenix. I personally will be damned if I let my Phoenix fall into the hands of a madman hell-bent on creating a pseudo-Roman empire." Mr. Swilling was clearly very passionate about the actions of that Legion group and looked back at me. There was a brief moment of silence before he said, "So, will you join us?" I tried to wrap my head around the unusual experiences of the past few days and asked, "So, you just want to hire me as an extra gun to fight in an underground war against everyone Phoenix considers an enemy? Most notably, this Legion group?" He saw my confusion and empathized by saying, "I understand your skepticism, but a name like yours with ties to Tucson can be a great thing for the people of Arizona. You can help us and put your name in the history books as one of the few who actually did good in the face of Sonoran heat. Or you can go back to your shack in the wildlife preserve and bide your time before dying to disease, some wasteland monster, or getting enslaved in the Legion's army. And yes, we know where you live, but the choice is yours. I won't try to sway you one way or the other." I had to think. I never in a million years would have thought that I'd join a militant organization to fight for the people of a city I only just visited. A city that threw me in jail and threatened to hang me within my first few minutes at the gate. I wasn't sure what to do or say as Mr. Swilling, Bailey, and Doc Martin stared at me. However, something deep inside answered for me. After a long silence, I said, "I'll do it." Chapter 10, Those First Days. I stayed at the Capitol for a few days with the doc, and after a brief examination of my abilities, I was appointed to Junior Agent. In my initiation, the Resistance members gave me new clothes including tactical pants, combat boots, a scrapper's hoodie, a leather bandolier, and a pack with basic survival equipment. The goal was to make the agents look like your everyday caravan guard, trader, or scavenger. They designated me as the team's shotgunner, and I received a pump-action shotgun with a sawed-off stock and barrel. I was given a light munition supply of 35 12-gauge shells and enough water for daily operations. Shortly after talking with Mr. Swilling on that first day, I was introduced to the team I'd be working with. Doc Martin was our team's doctor and leader. Then I was given a brief on his responsibilities and how teams were supposed to interact in the field, or on individual missions. Everyone in the team was to report to Doc Martin with espionage reports after separations for more than 5 days, and all group communications with outsiders were to be conducted by him. Then I got to meet the other members of Doc Martin's team. Of course, Bailey was a part of his group, and since I was the most familiar with her, I felt better in my new environment. They wanted me to be with Bailey for that very reason, and given our brief history, it was her job to answer any questions I had as I shadowed her. I thought a lot about how well she cleaned up and her obvious closeness to Jack Swilling himself. After that first meeting, I asked her what her relation was to the boss, but she remained silent about the matter. I then assumed that she was the wife or girlfriend of the aging resistance leader. I remember thinking a lot about how stunning the pale redhead looked when I first entered the capital, and how completely different she appeared when the woman brought me back to consciousness with hard liquor. My questions about her disguising ability only intensified throughout those first few days at the capital. It seemed like every time I saw her, she appeared different in one way or another. On a few occasions, she'd go into another room, and when I followed her a minute later, she was wearing something completely different and refused to acknowledge how that happened. Her personality still remained the same despite what she was wearing. The first time I ever spoke to the woman, she seemed like a social and good-natured caravan guard. Though she was oddly silent during my meeting with Jack, her personality quickly reverted back to a social one as I got my footing. She was nice and answered all my questions during those first days, and I was able to give her a proper thanks for having me rescued from jail. She even kept her word and bought me a new pair of jeans after a short run into town. The other 2 members of the Doc's team were Sykes and Brutus. Sykes was a scrawny white tribal from the north who fled to Phoenix after his tribe was assimilated into the Legion 2 years prior. Sykes never answered the question of which tribe he belonged to, but a number of the other resistance agents eventually learned. He was our team's assaultman. Though he was very reserved and spoke broken English, Doc Martin told me about times the guy decimated entire patrols of preppers and raiders with plenty of explosives and relentless 10mm automatic gunfire. Living his whole life as a warrior in a Legion-absorbed tribe allowed Mr. Swilling to easily channel Sykes' inner rage towards the Resistance's goals. Brutus was the last member of Doc's little team. He was a large wasteland gun for hire. After being saved by the Resistance from the atomic stalkers, he joined up. The giant man had scars and burns all over his exposed body from many years of desert warfare. When I said he was large, I meant that he was simply big. The guy was around my height of 5'10", but was as muscular as could be. Everyone in the team had to be personable and inconspicuous during espionage-related tasks, but his role in the team was in support of Sykes and me. The team's dynamic for assaults and combating desert hostiles was fairly simple. I didn't have any experience at this point, but Sykes and I were to storm positions with our close-range guns. Doc had a scoped and suppressed lever-action rifle for long-range sniping. Bailey's specialties involved a semi-automatic assault carbine, and Brutus held the role of suppressor. The giant man could easily cart around his bulky 5.56 light machine gun and several belts of ammo. I had little real combat experience at this point, but I couldn't wait to see that man rain lead upon desert raiders. Meeting the team was nice, but those first few days in the Resistance were all training. When it became clear that I knew almost nothing about the situation in the Arizona wasteland, Bailey was sure to enlighten me. Bailey told me that despite the Resistance knowing who I was from stories down south, she didn't recognize me out by Agua Caliente. The woman laughingly said how she planned to pry information out of me when she thought I was a Legion scout. She obviously changed her plans when she learned who I actually was through conversation and my own ignorance. Anyhow, she told me a brief history of the Resistance, its role in the wastes, and typical missions I could expect. Swilling's Resistance was created 17 years ago, in the year 2244, by Mr. Jack Swilling himself. Jack Swilling was a scaver from Phoenix for most of his life, but was one of the few to scavenge the ruins of Phoenix proper. 17 years ago, Jack's team of scavers explored the Arizona Capitol building, which used to be an explorer's taboo. After battling hordes of irradiated feral ghouls and losing over a dozen men, they finally cleared the place. There, he found the intact portrait of his own ancestor. Not knowing who the portrait depicted, the man went through the old archives and realized his destiny. Jack's last name was Swilling his whole life, but learning the name and story behind the last surviving portrait was a sign from God. From there, Jack Swilling formed his Resistance and got involved with the Phoenix government. The resistance grew and grew from survivors of Arizona warfare, and sought to bring justice against those who harmed the innocent of Arizona. Though Jack Swilling cleared the capital 17 years ago, the resistance operated out of saloons and brothels in Phoenix for years. The capital's restoration was a side project for most of the resistance's history, but in 2257, the project was done, and Mr. Swilling moved the resistance's headquarters to where it currently stood. Some agents initially thought that setting up the capital as its HQ was very inconvenient, but Mr. Swilling didn't see it that way. The capital was several miles deep inside the irradiated mess of Phoenix ruins, but that was the perfect reason to operate out of it. Between roving packs of feral ghouls, mutated monsters, and the high levels of radiation in the Phoenix ruins, the capital was nearly impervious to infiltration and raider attacks. Upon learning the history of my new organization, I couldn't help but ask my mentor about the city they protected. The resistance operated on behalf of everyone who calls the Sonoran Wastes home, but Mr. Swilling's primary allegiance was to Phoenix itself. I heard stories about Phoenix from my time in Tucson, but I was amazed when I got to see the place firsthand. Phoenix stirred to life in the early days after the bombs first fell. Old World Phoenix was hit by 3 separate nukes of unusually large proportions. I remember hearing stories out west about old cities targeted by upwards of 50 nukes, but some of those places weren't nearly as devastated as Phoenix. The ruins of Phoenix were seated in a valley surrounded by mountains, but the city itself was flat as could be. All it took was 3 large nukes to obliterate the miles and miles of metropolis. So the current city of Phoenix grew out of the survivors of the blast. Stories about those days talk of powerful winds and sandstorms from the west, pushing all the fallout away from the few places unaffected by the detonation. The survivors of Phoenix banded together and managed to do what most desert towns couldn't: thrive. Food was scarce, but surplus water from the Colorado Reservoir brought the city to life as a hub for water trade. Coincidentally, the outskirts of Phoenix had pre-war state-of-the-art water treatment facilities that were barely touched by the bombs, which allowed the radioactive Colorado River water to be used by humans. Over the course of almost 200 years, Phoenix became known as one of the few civilized settlements in the whole desert. With the never-ending tribal and raider wars, Phoenix welcomed refugees of those conflicts with open arms and offered safety in numbers. So, the current people of Phoenix kept their welcoming tradition alive, but with a little more caution due to growing threats outside the valley. After those first couple of days, I knew most of what I needed to be an effective junior agent, and Doc Martin was given an assignment. I was known as a pistolero down in Tucson, but my reputation wasn't backed by much in all reality. This first assignment was where I'd put my skills, or lack of skills, to the test. Doc gathered us all up from our quarters in the right wing of the Capitol and walked us to the rotunda and portrait for a briefing. After getting a barely useful brief on our mission, the others nodded with determination, and we headed out.